The crack echoed across the training yard like a gunshot. 298 Marines stood frozen in formation, watching their company captain writhe on the ground, clutching what used to be his elbow. The silence that followed was deafening. Not one of them had expected to see their commanding officer brought down by the quiet woman they'd all dismissed as just another Pentagon desk jockey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I wasn't just another desk jockey. And when Captain Marcus Vale decided to put his hands on me in front of nearly 300 Marines, he learned the hard way that some people fight back harder than you expect. The morning started like any other at Camp Pendleton. The California sun was already beating down mercilessly at 0600, turning the concrete parade grounds into a furnace that would only get worse as the day wore on. I stood at the edge of the formation, watching Delta Company run through their morning PT routine, sweat already beading on my forehead, despite having done nothing more strenuous than walk from the barracks. My name is Sarah Chen, and according to my orders, I was there as a liaison from Marine Corps Combat Development Command. What those orders didn't specify was that I'd spent the last 6 years developing new hand-to-hand combat techniques based on mixed martial arts principles, techniques that were about to be integrated into basic Marine training whether the old guard liked it or not. The problem was, Captain Marcus Vale definitely didn't like it. He'd made that clear from the moment I'd reported for duty 3 days earlier. A 20-year veteran with deployments stretching from Fallujah to Helmand Province, Vale represented everything traditional about Marine Corps culture. Square jaw, regulation haircut, and the kind of muscular build that came from decades of treating physical fitness like a religion. He looked at me the way a mechanic might look at a computer trying to diagnose an engine problem. Suspicious, skeptical, and convinced that whatever I represented was unnecessary complexity in a world that worked just fine with simple solutions. During our initial briefing, he'd listened to my presentation about integrated combat systems with the patient expression of a man enduring a root canal. When I finished explaining how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu principles could enhance Marine close-quarters combat effectiveness, he leaned back in his chair and delivered his verdict with characteristic bluntness. "Ma'am, with all due respect, Marines have been winning fights with good old-fashioned aggression and superior firepower since 1775. We don't need some fancy dancing moves to teach us how to handle business." His senior staff had chuckled appreciatively. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had nodded like Vale had just quoted scripture. Even Gunnery Sergeant Williams, who I'd heard was progressive by Marine standards, had worn the kind of polite smile you'd give a child who just explained why vegetables should be dessert. The dismissal stung, but it wasn't unexpected. I'd encountered the same attitude at Quantico, at Marine Corps Base Hawaii, and at every installation where I'd attempted to introduce modern combatives training. The Marine Corps had a culture that revered tradition, and tradition said that Marines learned to fight by learning to be tougher than whoever they were fighting. What none of them knew was that I hadn't learned my combat skills in a Pentagon conference room or a university laboratory. I'd learned them in places that didn't exist on official maps, during operations that never made into after-action reports. Before my assignment to Combat Development Command, I'd spent 3 years attached to Marine Special Operations Command. Not in an administrative capacity, not as a liaison or observer, but as an operator. I'd infiltrated hostile territory in Syria, conducted direct action raids in Somalia, and spent 6 months embedded with Kurdish forces fighting ISIS in northern Iraq. The mixed martial arts training hadn't been academic research. It had been survival. When you're operating behind enemy lines with a 4-person team and traditional Marine Corps hand-to-hand training assumes you'll always have backup in superior numbers, you learn to adapt quickly. You learn techniques that work when you're alone, outnumbered, and fighting for your life against people who've been killing since they were children. But those operations were classified at levels that meant I could never mention them in polite conversation. As far as Captain Vale and his Marines were concerned, I was just another staff officer with theories about how things should work, as opposed to practical knowledge of how things actually worked when bullets started flying. The morning PT session was typical Marine Corps efficiency. 298 Marines moving in perfect synchronization through exercises that had been refined over decades of turning civilians into warriors. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a 3-mile run that would leave most civilian athletes gasping for breath. I watched from the sidelines, taking notes on physical conditioning standards and trying to identify opportunities where modern combatives training might integrate with existing programs. The Marines were impressive. Every one of them was in phenomenal physical condition, moving with the kind of disciplined precision that spoke to months of intensive training. But I also noticed gaps. Their hand-to-hand combat practice was limited to basic boxing movements and wrestling techniques that assumed they'd always be fighting opponents who followed the same rules they did. In real combat, especially the kind of asymmetric warfare that defined modern conflicts, those assumptions could get you killed. Captain Vale approached me as his Marines finished their run, his uniform somehow still crisp despite the heat and exertion. "Getting everything you need for your report, ma'am?" he asked, emphasizing the last word in a way that made it clear he considered my presence an unnecessary bureaucratic intrusion. "I'm observing current training methodologies to identify areas where integrated combatives might enhance combat effectiveness," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. Vale's laugh was short and humorless. "Combat effectiveness, right." He gestured toward his Marines, who were now forming up for weapons training. "You see those men, ma'am? Every one of them can put 3 rounds center mass at 300 meters. Every one of them can hump 20 miles with full gear and still have enough left in the tank to take a hill when they get there. That's combat effectiveness." "Hand-to-hand combat skills complement marksmanship and physical conditioning," I said. "They don't replace them. In urban environments, close-quarter situations, or when weapons malfunction, having additional combat options can mean the difference between mission success and casualties." "Additional combat options," Vale repeated, shaking his head. "Ma'am, if one of my Marines gets close enough to an enemy to need hand-to-hand combat, something has gone very wrong with the mission planning. We don't win fights by getting into wrestling matches. We win fights by shooting the other guy before he gets close enough to matter." Master Sergeant Rodriguez joined the conversation, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "Captain's right, ma'am. 18 years in the Corps, 4 combat deployments, and I've never seen a situation where knowing karate would have made the difference. Marines win because we're tougher, better trained, and we never quit. That's all the combat effectiveness we need." The discussion was interrupted by Corporal Jackson, one of Vale's junior Marines, who approached with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he had something to say but wasn't sure if he should say it. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Vale nodded. "Go ahead, Jackson." "Sir, I was wondering if the liaison officer might be willing to demonstrate some of these techniques she's talking about. Some of the guys were curious about what this integrated combat stuff actually looks like in practice." The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired round. I could see Vale calculating, trying to decide whether allowing a demonstration would be a harmless way to humor his Marines or a dangerous precedent that might undermine his authority. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, Corporal," he said finally. "The liaison officer is here to observe, not to conduct training." But I could see the opportunity, and I'd been waiting 3 days for exactly this kind of opening. "Actually, Captain, I'd be happy to provide a demonstration. It might help illustrate how these techniques integrate with existing Marine Corps training." Vale's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's appropriate, Corporal," he said finally. "The liaison officer is here to observe, not to conduct training." But I could see the opportunity, and I'd been waiting 3 days for exactly this kind of opening. "Actually, Captain, I'd be happy to provide a demonstration. It might help illustrate how these techniques integrate with existing Marine Corps training." Vale's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Ma'am, I'm not sure our insurance would cover civilian contractors conducting combat demonstrations." "I'm not a civilian contractor, Captain. I'm a Marine Corps officer, same as you." The distinction mattered, and we both knew it. As a Marine officer, I had the authority to conduct training demonstrations, especially in my area of expertise. Vale couldn't dismiss me as easily as he could a civilian consultant. "Very well," he said after a long pause, "but we'll keep it simple. Basic demonstration of principles, nothing that might result in injuries." What happened next would change everything. But at that moment, standing in the blazing California sun with nearly 300 Marines watching, I thought I was just going to show them a few techniques and maybe earn a small measure of professional respect. I had no idea that Captain Vale was about to make the kind of mistake that would echo through Marine Corps training facilities for years to come. The demonstration area Vale selected was a patch of sand between the barracks and the motor pool, a space normally used for vehicle maintenance that had been cleared for the occasion. Within minutes, word had spread through the company like wildfire. Marines appeared from every direction, some still dripping with sweat from PT, others emerging from the mess hall with coffee cups in hand. The official formation of 298 had grown to include nearly every Marine on the base who could find an excuse to be there. Vale stood at the center of the impromptu arena, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from 2 decades of never backing down from a challenge. "All right, Marines, gather round. The liaison officer is going to show us some of these new combat techniques she's been talking about." The crowd formed a loose circle around us, their faces showing the kind of polite skepticism that Marines reserved for anything that hadn't been proven in combat. I could hear murmured conversations, fragments of speculation about what they were about to witness. $10 says she shows us some kind of dance moves," whispered Lance Corporal Hayes. "My money's on yoga," replied Private First Class Thompson. "Pentagon loves that wellness crap." Vale raised his hand for silence. "Now, ma'am, I'm thinking we keep this academic. Maybe you could walk us through some basic principles, explain the theory behind these integrated techniques." The suggestion was reasonable, professional, and exactly what I should have accepted. A theoretical demonstration would have satisfied the Marines' curiosity without creating any potential for conflict or embarrassment. But something in Vale's tone set off alarm bells in my head. There was a subtle condescension there, a suggestion that theory was all I had to offer. "Actually, Captain, I think a practical demonstration would be more valuable. Combat techniques need to be seen in action to be properly understood." Vale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's wise. These techniques haven't been approved for Marine Corps training yet. We don't want anyone getting hurt over something that's still in the development phase." "I understand your concern, Captain, but I'm confident we can conduct a safe demonstration. Perhaps you could serve as my training partner. Your experience would help illustrate how these techniques work against a skilled opponent." The words hung in the air like a challenge, which was exactly how I'd intended them. Around us, the Marines had gone quiet, sensing something shift in the dynamics of what they'd expected to be a routine briefing. Vale's expression hardened. This wasn't just about combat techniques anymore. This was about authority, about respect, about who belonged in the Marine Corps and who was just visiting. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I think it would be more appropriate if one of my junior Marines served as a demonstration partner, someone closer to your size and experience level." The insult was delivered with perfect military courtesy, but it was an insult nonetheless. Vale was suggesting that I wasn't qualified to train with a real Marine, that I needed to be protected from the kind of physical contact that his men dealt with every day. "Captain, I've been training in combatives for 6 years. I'm confident I can handle a controlled demonstration with an experienced partner. Unless you have concerns about your ability to participate safely?" The question was a calculated provocation, and Vale recognized it immediately. Around us, nearly 300 Marines watched the exchange with growing interest. Their company commander was being challenged by a staff officer, and how he responded would define his credibility for months to come. Vale's expression hardened. This wasn't just about combat techniques anymore. This was about authority, about respect, about who belonged in the Marine Corps and who was just visiting. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I think it would be more appropriate if one of my junior Marines served as a demonstration partner, someone closer to your size and experience level." The insult was delivered with perfect military courtesy, but it was an insult nonetheless. Vale was suggesting that I wasn't qualified to train with a real Marine, that I needed to be protected from the kind of physical contact that his men dealt with every day. "Captain, I've been training in combatives for 6 years. I'm confident I can handle a controlled demonstration with an experienced partner. Unless you have concerns about your ability to participate safely?" The question was a calculated provocation, and Vale recognized it immediately. Around us, nearly 300 Marines watched the exchange with growing interest. Their company commander was being challenged by a staff officer, and how he responded would define his credibility for months to come. Vale's expression hardened. This wasn't just about combat techniques anymore. This was about authority, about respect, about who belonged in the Marine Corps and who was just visiting. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I think it would be more appropriate if one of my junior Marines served as a demonstration partner, someone closer to your size and experience level." The insult was delivered with perfect military courtesy, but it was an insult nonetheless. Vale was suggesting that I wasn't qualified to train with a real Marine, that I needed to be protected from the kind of physical contact that his men dealt with every day. "Captain, I've been training in combatives for 6 years. I'm confident I can handle a controlled demonstration with an experienced partner. Unless you have concerns about your ability to participate safely?" The question was a calculated provocation, and Vale recognized it immediately. Around us, nearly 300 Marines watched the exchange with growing interest. Their company commander was being challenged by a staff officer, and how he responded would define his credibility for months to come. "Very well, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of cold formality that preceded violence. "We'll conduct a controlled demonstration. Basic grappling, nothing excessive." Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Sir, maybe we should reconsider. The liability issues alone." Vale waved him off. "It's fine, Master Sergeant. The liaison officer knows what she's doing. Don't you, ma'am?" The Marines formed a tighter circle around us, their earlier casual interest replaced by the focused attention of warriors who sensed they were about to witness something significant. Vale stripped off his uniform blouse, revealing the kind of muscled physique that came from decades of military PT and combat deployments. His arms were crisscrossed with scars that spoke to experiences in places where combat was more than theoretical. I removed my own blouse, ignoring the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. Underneath, I wore the same green undershirt as every other Marine, but I could feel the weight of their attention, the skepticism that came from seeing someone they'd categorized as a desk officer preparing for physical confrontation. Vale assumed a basic wrestling stance, his feet spread shoulder-width apart, his hands extended toward me in a position that would allow him to grab or strike depending on how the demonstration developed. His movements were economical, practiced, the result of years of combatives training that emphasized strength and aggression over technique. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am," he said, his tone suggesting he was humoring a child who wanted to play soldier. I studied his stance for a moment, noting the distribution of his weight, the positioning of his hands, the way he favored his left side slightly. These were details that most people wouldn't notice, but I'd been trained to read body language the way other people read books. The first exchange was almost gentle. Vale reached for my wrist, intending to demonstrate a basic control technique that would allow him to guide me to the ground without causing injury. It was exactly the kind of move an experienced Marine might use to subdue a civilian without escalating to more serious violence. But I wasn't a civilian, and the moment his hand made contact with my wrist, I pivoted, using his momentum against him to break his grip and establish a wrist control of my own. The movement was so smooth that most of the watching Marines probably missed it entirely, but Vale felt it immediately. His expression shifted from patronizing confidence to professional interest. The woman he'd expected to overwhelm with basic strength had just demonstrated that she understood leverage and timing better than most of his Marines. "Interesting," he said, resetting his position. "Let's see what else you've got." The second exchange was more aggressive. Vale shot forward, attempting a double-leg takedown that would have put most opponents on their backs within seconds. But instead of trying to resist his superior strength, I used his forward momentum to execute a sprawl that not only defended against the takedown, but left me in a dominant position with control of his head and shoulders. Around us, the Marines had gone completely silent. What they were watching wasn't a demonstration anymore. It was a competition between their company commander and an officer they'd all underestimated. Vale struggled to his feet, his face flushed with exertion and something that might have been embarrassment. "All right, ma'am, I think we've seen enough for a basic demonstration." But something had changed in the air between us. The respectful boundaries that had governed our interaction were dissolving, replaced by the kind of primal competition that drove men and women to test themselves against each other in ways that transcended rank and protocol. "Actually, Captain, I think one more technique might be valuable, something that demonstrates how leverage can overcome strength disadvantages." Vale's eyes narrowed. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't going according to the script he'd envisioned. "Ma'am, I think we should conclude the demonstration here." "Are you sure, Captain? Your Marines seem interested in seeing more." The challenge was unmistakable now, and Vale was faced with a choice that would define how his Marines viewed him. He could end the demonstration and accept what might be perceived as backing down from a staff officer, or he could continue and risk further embarrassment. Pride made the decision for him. One more technique, then we're done. What happened next unfolded in seconds but seemed to stretch across hours. Vale lunged forward with the kind of aggressive confidence that had served him well in 2 decades of military service. But instead of the compliant training partner he'd expected, he encountered something else entirely. I sidestepped his charge, caught his extended arm, and used his own forward momentum to execute a perfect arm drag that sent him stumbling past me. Before he could recover, I'd secured an underhook and was working for position that would demonstrate the submission technique I'd planned to show. But Vale had spent 20 years in the Marine Corps, and Marines don't give up easily. Instead of accepting the control I was establishing, he tried to power out of the position, using brute strength to escape what should have been a controlled demonstration. That was his first mistake. The second was underestimating how seriously I took challenges to my professional credibility. When he drove his elbow back toward my ribs in an attempt to break my grip, the controlled demonstration became something else entirely. The armbar happened so fast that most of the watching Marines probably didn't understand what they'd seen until it was over. Vale's arm was extended and hyperextended, caught between my legs in a position that left him completely helpless. One small adjustment of pressure would dislocate his elbow. A slightly larger adjustment would break it entirely. For a moment, time stopped. Nearly 300 Marines stood frozen, watching their company commander trapped in a submission hold by the officer they'd all dismissed as a Pentagon bureaucrat. Vale's face was twisted with pain and the dawning realization that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. "Tap out, Captain," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. But Vale was a 20-year Marine who'd never surrendered to anything in his life. Instead of tapping, instead of acknowledging defeat, he made one final attempt to power out of the hold. That was when his elbow broke. The sound was unmistakable, a wet crack that cut through the desert air like a rifle shot, followed immediately by Vale's scream of pain and rage. I released the hold instantly, rolling away from him as he clutched his arm, his face contorted with an agony that went beyond the physical damage. The silence that followed was absolute. 298 Marines stood motionless, their faces showing expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to something that might have been awe. Their company commander, a man they'd followed through 3 combat deployments, was writhing on the ground, defeated by a woman they'd collectively dismissed as irrelevant. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to move, dropping to his knees beside Vale with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic. "Corpsman?" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the training area with parade ground authority. "We need a corpsman here now." Vale's breathing came in sharp, controlled bursts as he fought to master the pain. Even injured, even humiliated, he was trying to maintain the bearing expected of a Marine officer. But the arm hanging at an unnatural angle told its own story, and no amount of military discipline could disguise what had just happened. "Sir, we need to get you to medical," Rodriguez said, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. "That arm needs immediate attention." "I'm fine, Master Sergeant," Vale gasped, attempting to sit up. The movement sent another wave of pain across his features, and he sagged back against Rodriguez's supporting arm. It's just a sprain." But we all knew it wasn't just a sprain. The way his forearm bent where no joint existed made that clear to everyone present.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd felt the bone give way under the pressure of the armbar, had heard the distinctive sound of structural failure that meant months of rehabilitation and permanent changes to Vale's range of motion. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Martinez arrived at a run, his medical bag bouncing against his hip as he dropped down beside Vale. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, assessing the injury, preparing a field splint that would stabilize the arm for transport. "Captain, I need to immobilize this before we move you," Martinez said, his voice carrying the calm authority that good medics developed. "This is going to hurt, but I need you to stay still." As Martinez worked, the crowd of Marines began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment that would be discussed in squad bays and mess halls for years to come. The quiet staff officer had not only defeated their company commander, but had done it with a technique that most of them had never seen before. I stood apart from the medical activity, my heart still pounding with adrenaline and something else. Regret, maybe? Or recognition of how badly this situation had spiraled beyond what either of us had intended. What had started as a professional disagreement about training methods had become personal, then physical, and finally destructive. Gunnery Sergeant Williams approached me as the corpsman finished his preliminary treatment. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense the wheels turning behind his eyes as he processed what he just witnessed. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that was some serious technique. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" The question everyone was thinking, but no one else had been brave enough to ask directly. I could have deflected, could have given him the official version about Combat Development Command and research into integrated fighting systems, but something about the moment, about the respect I heard in his voice, made me decide on honesty. "Somalia," I said simply, 3 years ago. Hostage rescue operation that went sideways when our extraction helicopter took small arms fire. Spent 18 hours in Mogadishu with a 4-person team, moving through hostile territory to reach an alternate landing zone. Williams's eyebrows rose slightly. "You were with MARSOC?" "Attached to them, yes. The techniques you just saw aren't theoretical, Gunny. They're what kept me alive when traditional Marine Corps combatives weren't enough." The evacuation helicopter arrived with typical military efficiency, its rotor wash sending clouds of sand across the training area. Vale was loaded onto a stretcher, his face pale but his jaw set in the kind of determined expression that Marines wore when they refused to acknowledge defeat even in the face of overwhelming evidence. As the medical crew secured him for transport, Vale's eyes found mine across the chaos of the evacuation. For a moment, the pain and humiliation were replaced by something else. Not respect exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement that he'd underestimated not just my capabilities, but the realities of modern combat. "This isn't over, ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible above the helicopter noise. "No, sir," I replied. "I don't suppose it is." The helicopter lifted off, carrying Vale toward definitive medical care and leaving behind a training area that felt fundamentally changed. The Marines who remained were looking at me differently now, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by a cautious interest that bordered on respect. Colonel James Harrison arrived 20 minutes later, his staff car kicking up dust clouds as it raced across the parade ground. As the battalion commander, he'd undoubtedly received word about what had happened within minutes of Vale's departure. His expression as he climbed out of the vehicle suggested that he was not pleased with recent developments. "Officer Chen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of icy formality that preceded severe disciplinary action. "I understand there's been an incident during a training demonstration." "Yes, sir. Captain Vale sustained an injury during a combatives demonstration." "The injury was accidental, sir." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Accidental? I see. And this accidental injury occurred during what kind of demonstration exactly?" "Integrated combatives training, sir. Captain Vale volunteered to serve as a training partner to demonstrate submission techniques. The injury occurred when he attempted to escape from a controlled hold using excessive force." The explanation was technically accurate, but left out crucial details about the escalating tension that had preceded the demonstration. Harrison was experienced enough to recognize what I wasn't saying and smart enough to understand the political implications of what had just happened. "Officer Chen, in my 30 years in the Marine Corps, I've never seen a training demonstration result in a company commander being evacuated with a broken arm. Either you're the most dangerous woman in the Corps, or this wasn't just a routine demonstration." "Sir, Captain Vale and I had professional disagreements about the value of integrated combatives training. Those disagreements may have influenced the intensity of the demonstration." "Professional disagreements?" Harrison repeated the phrase like he was tasting something unpleasant. "And these professional disagreements resulted in you breaking a fellow officer's arm in front of his entire company?" Around us, Marines were still lingering, pretending to go about their duties while clearly listening to every word of the conversation. This disciplinary meeting was as public as the demonstration had been, and everyone present understood that my response would determine not just my immediate future, but the broader question of whether the Marine Corps was ready to accept new approaches to combat training. "Sir, Captain Vale challenged the validity of techniques that have been combat-tested and proven effective. When given the opportunity to demonstrate those techniques, I did so. The injury was an unfortunate result of Captain Vale's decision to resist a controlled submission rather than acknowledge the technique's effectiveness." Harrison studied my face for a long moment, looking for something that I wasn't sure I wanted him to find. Finally, he nodded toward his staff car. "Get in, Officer Chen. We're going to have a longer conversation about this incident and about your future in the Marine Corps." As I walked toward the car, I could feel the eyes of nearly 300 Marines following me. Some were hostile, loyal to their injured commander and resentful of the outsider who'd humiliated him. Others were curious, intrigued by techniques they'd never seen before. And a few, I thought, were beginning to understand that combat effectiveness came in forms their traditional training had never prepared them to recognize. The drive to battalion headquarters was conducted in silence. Harrison focused on the road, while I stared out at the passing landscape and wondered if my military career had just ended on a patch of sand between the barracks and the motor pool. What I didn't know was that word of the demonstration was already spreading beyond Camp Pendleton, carried by Marines who'd witnessed something extraordinary and couldn't wait to share it with their colleagues at other bases. Within hours, the story would reach Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, where senior officers would be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about training methods, about gender integration, and about whether the Corps was prepared for the realities of 21st-century warfare. But that was still in the future. For now, I sat in Colonel Harrison's staff car, watching familiar landmarks pass by and wondering whether I'd just proven my point about the value of integrated combatives training or destroyed my career in the most spectacular way possible. Harrison's office was exactly what you'd expect from a career Marine. American flag in the corner, unit citations covering one wall, and a desk that looked like it had survived several decades of military service. He gestured toward a chair facing his desk, then settled into his own seat with the deliberate movements of a man who'd learned to think before speaking. "Close the door," he said quietly. I did as instructed, then returned to the indicated chair. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute while Harrison studied a file folder that I assumed contained my personnel records. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Sarah Chen, commissioned through Officer Candidate School 7 years ago. Infantry Officer Course graduate, top 15% of her class. Multiple deployments with MARSOC, all classified above my clearance level." He paused, flipping through several pages. reassigned to Combat Development Command 6 months ago after what's diplomatically described as a disagreement with operational priorities. Yes, sir, that's accurate. What the file doesn't tell me is how an officer with your background ended up breaking another Marine's arm during what was supposed to be a routine training demonstration. The question was fair, and Harrison's tone suggested genuine interest rather than accusation. I took a breath and decided that after everything that had happened, complete honesty was the only viable strategy. Sir, Captain Vale dismissed integrated combatives training without understanding what it was or why it might be valuable. When his Marines expressed interest in seeing a demonstration, he agreed, but insisted on treating it like a game rather than a serious training evolution. His attitude suggested that he viewed me as incompetent, and his approach to the demonstration reflected that assumption. So you decided to prove him wrong by breaking his arm? Sir, I decided to demonstrate the effectiveness of techniques that could save Marine lives in close-quarters combat situations. Captain Vale's injury occurred because he chose to resist a controlled submission with force rather than acknowledging the technique and allowing the demonstration to continue safely. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Officer Chen, do you understand the position you've put me in? I have a company commander in the hospital with a broken arm, 298 Marines who just watched their leader get dominated by a staff officer, and a training incident that's going to require reports all the way up to Marine Corps headquarters. Yes, sir, I understand the complexity of the situation. The complexity. Harrison's voice carried a trace of humor that I hadn't expected. That's one way to put it. Another way would be to say that you've just created the biggest personnel headache I've dealt with in 5 years of command. I waited for him to continue, uncertain whether I was about to be relieved of duty or court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer. On the other hand, Harrison continued, you've also just demonstrated that the Marine Corps might have been underutilizing your capabilities. The preliminary medical report says Vale's arm was broken cleanly, almost surgically. That suggests a level of technical precision that most Marines couldn't achieve if they tried. Sir, the techniques I demonstrated are designed to be precise. Overwhelming force isn't always the most effective approach to close-quarters combat. No, I suppose it isn't. Harrison opened another folder, this one containing what looked like operational reports. I've been reading about your work with MARSOC, classified operations in Syria and Somalia, direct action missions where traditional tactics weren't sufficient. Your commanding officers consistently rated you as exceptional, right up until your reassignment to Combat Development Command. The conversation was taking a direction I hadn't anticipated. Instead of disciplinary action, Harrison seemed to be conducting some kind of professional assessment. What happened in Syria, Officer Chen? What led to your reassignment? The question touched on classified material, but Harrison's clearance level meant I could discuss operational details that I'd never been able to share with Vale or his Marines. Sir, we were conducting a hostage rescue operation in Aleppo. Intelligence indicated minimal enemy presence, but when we breached the target building, we found it was a trap. 20-plus enemy fighters in prepared positions, civilians used as human shields, and our extraction route compromised. And my team leader was killed in the initial exchange. The senior NCO was wounded. Standard operating procedure called for withdrawal and airstrike, but that would have meant accepting civilian casualties that intelligence later confirmed were American aid workers. Harrison nodded slowly. So, you improvised? Yes, sir. I used close-quarters combat techniques to neutralize enemy positions that conventional tactics couldn't reach. The confined space and proximity of civilians made traditional weapons employment too dangerous. How many enemy fighters? 14 confirmed kills, sir. Hand-to-hand combat in close quarters using techniques that weren't part of standard Marine Corps training at the time. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, processing information that put my confrontation with Vale in an entirely different context. I wasn't just a staff officer with theoretical knowledge of combatives training, I was a combat veteran who'd used those techniques to save American lives in situations where conventional tactics had failed. The reassignment to Combat Development Command, he said finally. That wasn't punishment for exceeding authority. That was the Corps trying to figure out how to integrate what you'd learned into broader training programs. Yes, sir, but implementation has been challenging. Most commanders don't see the value in techniques that fall outside traditional Marine Corps doctrine. Like Captain Vale. Yes, sir, Captain Vale represents a common attitude toward innovations in combat training. Respect for tradition is important, but it shouldn't prevent us from adopting techniques that could save Marines' lives. Harrison closed the files and leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Officer Chen, what happened today is going to have consequences that extend far beyond this base.
The story of a female staff officer breaking a company commander's arm is going to spread through the Corps whether we wanted to or not. I felt my stomach tighten. Sir, I understand that my actions may have created problems for the Marine Corps' public image. Actually, you might have created the opposite problem. Within 6 hours of the incident, I've received 3 calls from other base commanders asking about integrated combatives training. Apparently, word travels fast when Marines see something that impresses them. The revelation was unexpected. I'd assumed that my confrontation with Vale would be seen as a disciplinary problem, not a validation of the training methods I'd been trying to promote. Sir, are you saying that other commands are interested in implementing integrated combatives programs? I'm saying that what happened today demonstrated something that PowerPoint presentations and theoretical discussions couldn't. You showed 300 Marines that there are combat techniques they don't know, techniques that might make the difference between mission success and failure. Harrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground where the incident had occurred. The question now is how we move forward. Captain Vale will be out of commission for at least 6 months. His company needs leadership, and they need someone who can bridge the gap between traditional Marine Corps values and the realities of modern combat. The implication was clear, but I wanted to hear it stated explicitly. Sir, what are you suggesting? Harrison turned back toward me, his expression serious but not unfriendly. I'm suggesting that you might be the right person to take command of Delta Company on a temporary basis. Your combat experience speaks for itself, and after today, those Marines know you're not someone they can dismiss or ignore. The offer was both an opportunity and a challenge that I'd never anticipated. Taking command of Vale's company would mean proving that the techniques I demonstrated could be integrated into a comprehensive training program. It would also mean dealing with Marines who might resent me for what had happened to their previous commander. Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I'm not sure the Marines of Delta Company would accept me as their commander after today. Officer Chen, those Marines just watched you defeat a 20-year veteran using techniques they'd never seen before. Some of them might resent you, but all of them respect effectiveness. If you can show them that your methods make them better Marines, they'll follow you. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Harrison called for whoever it was to enter, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped into the office. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see tension in his shoulders. Sir, I wanted to provide an update on Captain Vale's condition and to discuss the company's readiness status. Harrison nodded. Go ahead, Master Sergeant. Sir, Captain Vale is in surgery to repair his elbow. The doctors expect him to make a full recovery, but he'll be on limited duty for several months. As for the company, the Marines are processing what happened today. There's been a lot of discussion about the demonstration and its implications. What kind of discussion, Master Sergeant? I asked. Rodriguez looked at Harrison, who nodded permission for him to speak freely. Ma'am, honestly, it's been mixed. Some of the Marines are angry about what happened to the captain. They feel like he was set up or embarrassed unnecessarily. And the others? The others are asking when they can learn the techniques you demonstrated. They want to know if integrated combatives training is going to be made available to the entire company. The response revealed the complexity of leadership in an organization where respect had to be earned through demonstrated competence. Some of Vale's Marines remained loyal to their injured commander, but others were pragmatic enough to recognize the value of what they'd witnessed. Harrison looked at me expectantly. "Well, Officer Chen, are you ready to show Delta Company what integrated combatives training can do for Marines who are willing to learn?" The weight of Harrison's question settled on my shoulders like field equipment before a long march. Taking command of Delta Company would mean more than just temporarily replacing an injured officer. It would mean proving that everything I'd advocated for, everything I demonstrated that morning, could translate into improved combat effectiveness for an entire unit of Marines. "Sir, I accept the assignment," I said, the words carrying more conviction than I actually felt. "But I'll need your support when the inevitable complaints start coming in." Harrison's smile was grim but genuine. "Officer Chen, after today, I think you've proven you can handle complaints. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, what's your assessment of the company's readiness to accept new leadership?" Rodriguez shifted his weight slightly, a tell that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Sir, the Marines respect competence above everything else. What they saw today was competence, even if some of them don't like how it was demonstrated. If Officer Chen can show them that her methods make them better warfighters, they'll adapt. And if she can't, then we'll have the same problems we've always had, plus a few new ones." The honesty was refreshing, even if it wasn't particularly encouraging. Rodriguez was telling us that I'd have one chance to prove myself, and failure would leave Delta Company worse off than it had under Vale's traditional leadership. "When do you want me to take command?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning. Rodriguez will brief you on the company's current status, training schedule, and personnel issues. I'll handle the official paperwork and notifications up the chain of command." As we left Harrison's office, Rodriguez fell into step beside me, his expression thoughtful. The walk back to the company area gave us privacy to discuss details that hadn't been appropriate in front of the battalion commander. "Ma'am, I need to be straight with you about what you're walking into," he said as we crossed the parade ground. "Delta Company has been Captain Vale's unit for 3 years. These Marines have followed him through 2 deployments, and their loyalty to him runs deep. What happened today is going to create divisions that won't be easy to heal." "What kind of divisions, Master Sergeant?" "You've got Marines who saw what you did and recognized that you might have something valuable to teach them. But you've also got Marines who feel like you humiliated their commanding officer, maybe unnecessarily. The challenge is going to be bridging that gap without losing either group." We passed the training area where the confrontation had occurred, now empty except for a few scattered pieces of equipment that hadn't been properly secured. The sand still showed scuff marks from the morning's activities, physical evidence of an incident that would reshape how Delta Company approached training. "What's your personal assessment, Master Sergeant? Do you think integrated combatives training has value for Marines?" Rodriguez stopped walking and turned to face me directly. His weathered face carried the kind of thoughtful expression that came from 20 years of evaluating new ideas against the reality of combat experience. "Ma'am, I've been in situations where traditional tactics weren't enough. Urban combat in Fallujah, where you're fighting house to house and sometimes room to room. If someone had offered me additional tools for close-quarters combat, tools that might have brought more of my Marines home alive, I would have taken them. But change is hard in the Corps, especially change that challenges established doctrine. You're going to have to prove that your methods work, not just in demonstrations, but in the kind of comprehensive training that prepares Marines for real combat." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several Marines from Delta Company. Lance Corporal Hayes and Private First Class Thompson, the same two who'd been making jokes about yoga and dance moves earlier that morning, approached with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they had something important to say. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his voice respectful but uncertain, "we heard you might be taking over the company temporarily." "That's correct, Lance Corporal. Is there something you wanted to discuss?" Thompson stepped forward, his youth and inexperience evident in the way he struggled to find the right words. "Ma'am, we were wondering, the techniques you used against Captain Vale, are those things regular Marines can learn, or do you need special training to make them work?"
The question was exactly what I'd been hoping to hear. These Marines had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about combat effectiveness, and now they wanted to know if they could develop those same capabilities. "Those techniques can be learned by any Marine willing to put in the training time," I said. "They're not magic, and they don't require special physical abilities. They require understanding, practice, and the willingness to think about combat in ways that might be different from your previous training." Hayes and Thompson exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the conversations that had been happening throughout Delta Company since the morning's demonstration. "Ma'am, some of the guys are saying that what happened today was just lucky, that traditional Marine Corps training is still the best foundation for combat effectiveness." "And what do you think, Lance Corporal?" "Ma'am, I think that if there are techniques that could make me a more effective Marine, I want to learn them. I don't care if they're traditional or not." Rodriguez nodded approvingly at Hayes' response. "That's the right attitude, Marine. Effectiveness matters more than tradition when bullets are flying." As the junior Marines returned to their duties, Rodriguez and I continued toward the company area. The barracks complex housed nearly 300 Marines in a series of two-story buildings that had been constructed during the base expansion of the early 2000s. Each building was home to a platoon, creating natural divisions that could either support or undermine unit cohesion depending on how they were managed. "Ma'am, we should discuss the platoon leaders," Rodriguez said as we approached the company headquarters. "First platoon is led by Lieutenant Michael Torres. Been with the unit for 8 months. Good officer, but he's still learning how to lead Marines who have more combat experience than he does." "How does he get along with his Marines?" "They respect him because he listens to his NCOs and doesn't try to prove he's the smartest person in the room. After what happened today, he's probably wondering how your leadership style will affect his platoon." We entered the company headquarters, a cramped office space that served as the administrative heart of Delta Company. The walls were covered with training schedules, personnel rosters, and unit citations that told the story of the company's operational history. Behind a desk that looked like it had survived several decades of military service sat Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Williams, the company's senior enlisted advisor. Williams stood as we entered, her bearing carrying the kind of professional competence that came from 15 years of Marine Corps service. She was one of the few female Marines in Delta Company, and I suspected that my appointment as temporary commander would create interesting dynamics for her as well. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I've been preparing briefing materials on the company's current status and upcoming training requirements." "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. I appreciate your efficiency." Williams gestured toward a conference table covered with folders, charts, and computer printouts. "Ma'am, if you're ready, I can brief you on personnel status, equipment readiness, and the training schedule that Captain Vale had established for the next 6 months." The briefing that followed was comprehensive and professional, covering everything from individual Marine qualification status to unit-level training requirements. Williams presented the information with the kind of detailed knowledge that demonstrated her mastery of the administrative complexities that kept a Marine company functional. Current personnel strength is 298 Marines, with 12 on temporary assignment to other units and 6 recovering from training injuries. "What about training readiness?" I asked. "The company is scheduled for a major field exercise in 6 weeks, followed by pre-deployment training that will prepare us for a rotation to the Middle East in 8 months. Captain Vale had established a training progression that emphasizes traditional Marine Corps skills: marksmanship, physical fitness, small unit tactics, and weapons maintenance." The briefing provided a clear picture of a well-run Marine company that was performing at high standards according to traditional metrics. But it also revealed opportunities for integration of new training methods that could enhance combat effectiveness without disrupting established programs. "Gunnery Sergeant, what's your assessment of the Marines' reaction to this morning's demonstration?" Williams paused, clearly weighing her response. "Ma'am, it's been mixed. Some Marines are excited about the possibility of learning new techniques. Others are concerned about changes to training methods that have served the Corps well for decades." "And your personal opinion?" "Ma'am, I think that any training that makes Marines more effective in combat situations is worth considering, but implementation will need to be carefully managed to maintain unit cohesion and morale." The diplomatic response told me that Williams was reserving judgment until she could observe my leadership style and assess whether integrated combat effectiveness would benefit or harm the Marines under her supervision.
Over the next several hours, I met with each of Delta Company's platoon leaders and senior NCOs.
The conversations followed a similar pattern: professional courtesy combined with cautious skepticism about changes to established training methods. None of them openly questioned my competence, but all of them were clearly wondering how my approach would affect their Marines' readiness and performance. Lieutenant Torres, the first platoon leader, was perhaps the most direct in his concerns. "Ma'am, my Marines have been training under Captain Vale's methods for months. They're comfortable with established routines and confident in their abilities. How do we introduce new techniques without undermining that confidence?" "Lieutenant, confidence that isn't based on comprehensive training is false confidence that can get Marines killed," I replied. "The goal isn't to replace everything your Marines have learned. It's to add tools that will make them more effective in situations where traditional techniques aren't sufficient." "What kind of situations, ma'am?" "Close quarters combat in urban environments, situations where firearms aren't practical or available, scenarios where Marines need to subdue rather than kill opponents, any time when having additional options could mean the difference between mission success and failure." Torres nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand the potential applications. "Ma'am, would it be possible to see a more comprehensive demonstration of these techniques? Something that shows how they integrate with traditional Marine Corps training rather than replacing it." The request was exactly what I'd been hoping for. Instead of resistance to new ideas, Torres was asking for information that would help him evaluate whether integrated combatives training could benefit his Marines. "Lieutenant, that's an excellent suggestion. I think a comprehensive demonstration would help all the Marines understand how these techniques fit into their existing skill sets." The first week of my temporary command was dedicated to observation and assessment. Instead of immediately implementing changes to Delta Company's training program, I spent time with each platoon, watching their current training methods and identifying opportunities for integration of combatives techniques. What I observed was impressive. Vale had developed a training program that produced Marines who were exceptionally competent in traditional military skills. Their marksmanship was outstanding, their physical fitness was excellent, and their small unit tactics were executed with precision and coordination. But I also noticed gaps that combatives training could address. During close quarters battle training, Marines relied heavily on firearms even in situations where hand-to-hand techniques might be more appropriate. In urban warfare simulations, they sometimes struggled with scenarios that required subduing rather than eliminating opponents. Most significantly, I observed that many Marines lacked confidence in their ability to handle unexpected close-quarter situations. They were superbly trained for scenarios they could anticipate, but less prepared for the kind of improvised combat that characterized modern asymmetric warfare. The breakthrough came during a training exercise designed to simulate urban combat. Second Platoon was conducting a building clearing operation when Private Martinez found himself separated from his fire team and confronted by an opponent who was too close for effective weapons employment. Martinez attempted to use his rifle as a club, but his opponent managed to grab the weapon, creating a wrestling match that left both fighters rolling on the ground in a tangle of equipment and limbs. The exercise had to be stopped while instructors separated the combatants and reset the scenario. "Ma'am," said Staff Sergeant Johnson, 2nd Platoon's senior NCO, "that's exactly the kind of situation where additional training might be valuable. Martinez is a good Marine, but he wasn't prepared for hand-to-hand combat at close range." "Staff Sergeant, would you be willing to let me demonstrate some techniques that might help Martinez handle that situation more effectively?" Johnson looked at the Marines gathered around us, all of whom had witnessed Martinez's struggle and understood its implications for real combat situations. "Ma'am, I think the Marines would be very interested in seeing those techniques." The demonstration that followed was carefully planned to avoid the confrontational dynamics that had led to Vale's injury. Instead of challenging anyone's competence, I focused on showing Marines how combatives techniques could complement their existing skills. Using Martinez as a volunteer, I demonstrated how proper positioning and leverage could allow a Marine to maintain control of his weapon even when an opponent attempted to grab it. I showed the platoon how simple techniques could create space for weapon employment, how joint manipulation could disable an attacker without requiring superior strength.
Most importantly, I demonstrated how combatives training could enhance rather than replace traditional Marine Corps values like aggression and determination. The techniques weren't about avoiding combat or minimizing violence. They were about being more effective in combat situations where traditional weapons might not be sufficient. The response was immediate and positive. Marines who had been skeptical about fancy fighting techniques suddenly understood that what I was offering was practical training that could save their lives in specific combat situations. "Ma'am," Martinez said after the demonstration, "could you show us more techniques like that? Stuff that would help us when things go wrong and we can't use our rifles the way we planned." Within hours, word of the demonstration had spread throughout Delta Company. Marines who had been resistant to change were suddenly asking their platoon leaders about integrated combatives training. The techniques I'd shown weren't theoretical or exotic. They were practical solutions to problems that Marines could easily imagine encountering in combat. The formal integration of combatives training into Delta Company's program began the following week. Instead of replacing existing training, I created supplementary sessions that focused on situations where traditional tactics needed enhancement. Mondays became close-quarters combat days, where Marines learned techniques for fighting in confined spaces where firearms weren't practical. Wednesdays focused on weapon retention and recovery, teaching Marines how to maintain control of their equipment when opponents attempted to disarm them. Fridays were dedicated to non-lethal subduing techniques, skills that were increasingly important in operations where Marines needed to capture rather than kill opponents. The training was demanding, both physically and mentally. Marines who were accustomed to solving problems with overwhelming firepower had to think tactically about leverage, timing, and positioning. Some struggled with techniques that required finesse rather than brute strength, but the majority adapted quickly, recognizing that combatives training enhanced rather than diminished their effectiveness as warriors. Lance Corporal Hayes, who had initially joked about dance moves and yoga, became one of the most dedicated students, spending extra time practicing techniques and helping train junior Marines. "Ma'am," he said after a particularly intense training session, "this stuff actually makes sense. It's like having additional tools in your toolkit, tools that work when your primary tools aren't available." The real validation came during a major training exercise 6 weeks into my command. Delta Company was tasked with conducting a complex urban warfare scenario that involved multiple objectives, civilian populations, and rules of engagement that severely limited the use of lethal force. Traditional Marine Corps training would have prepared the company for most aspects of the exercise, but several scenarios specifically required the kind of close-quarters, non-lethal techniques that had been integrated into their training program. First Platoon encountered a situation where they needed to subdue armed opponents without killing them, a scenario that would have been extremely difficult using traditional techniques. Instead, Marines used combatives training to systematically disable and capture their opponents, completing the objective without casualties or rules of engagement violations. Second Platoon found themselves in a building clearing operation where several rooms were too small for effective rifle employment. Rather than struggling with unwieldy weapons in confined spaces, Marines transitioned smoothly to hand-to-hand techniques, clearing rooms with efficiency and confidence. Most impressively, Third Platoon handled a hostage rescue scenario that required Marines to neutralize guards who were positioned too close to civilians for safe weapons employment. Using techniques that emphasized precision and control, they successfully completed the rescue without simulated civilian casualties that would have occurred using traditional methods. The exercise results were conclusive. Delta Company's performance exceeded that of other units using traditional training methods, particularly in scenarios that required flexibility and adaptation to unexpected circumstances. Colonel Harrison observed portions of the exercise, and his post-exercise comments reflected a significant shift in his assessment of integrated combatives training. "Officer Chen," he said during the after-action review, "the performance improvement in urban combat scenarios has been remarkable."
Delta Company handled situations that have traditionally been problematic for Marine units, and they did it with a level of confidence and competence that exceeded expectations. The success of the training program attracted attention beyond Camp Pendleton. Within 2 months, I was receiving requests from other Marine Corps installations for information about integrated combatives training methods. The techniques that had started as a personal project were becoming part of broader discussions about Marine Corps training evolution. Captain Vale returned to duty 4 months later, his arm functional but forever changed by the confrontation that had altered both our careers. The conversation we had upon his return was professional but significant. "Officer Chen," he said, entering my temporary office with the careful movements of someone still adjusting to physical limitations, "I wanted to discuss the transition back to company command." "Of course, sir. I've prepared comprehensive briefing materials on all training programs and personnel changes that occurred during your recovery." Vale settled into a chair across from my desk, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "I've been receiving reports about the company's performance during recent exercises. Apparently, the integrated training methods have been quite successful." "The Marines adapted well to the new techniques, sir. They recognized that the training enhanced rather than replaced their existing capabilities." "I owe you an apology," Vale said, his voice carrying the weight of months of reflection. "My initial resistance to integrated combatives training was based on assumptions rather than evidence. What you've accomplished with Delta Company demonstrates that I was wrong." The admission was significant, coming from a Marine officer who'd built his career on traditional approaches to training and leadership. Vale's ability to acknowledge error and adapt his thinking reflected the kind of intellectual honesty that the Marine Corps valued in its leaders. "Sir, resistance to new ideas is natural and often valuable. It ensures that changes are thoroughly tested before implementation. What happened between us was unfortunate, but it led to training improvements that will benefit Marines for years to come." Vale nodded, his expression suggesting that he'd reached similar conclusions during his recovery. "Officer Chen, I understand that you'll be rotating back to Combat Development Command next month. I wanted you to know that Delta Company will continue the integrated training program you established. The Marines have seen its value, and they won't let me abandon it even if I wanted to." The comment was delivered with a slight smile that suggested Vale had developed a new appreciation for training methods he'd once dismissed. His experience with injury and recovery had apparently provided perspective on the value of having multiple options when traditional approaches weren't sufficient. My final week with Delta Company was devoted to ensuring smooth transition back to Vale's command and documenting lessons learned from the integration of combatives training. The Marines who had initially been skeptical about my methods were now among their strongest advocates, having seen firsthand how the techniques enhanced their combat effectiveness. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had served as the bridge between traditional Marine Corps culture and innovative training methods, provided perhaps the most meaningful assessment of what had been accomplished. "Ma'am," he said during our final planning meeting, "when you first took command, I wasn't sure whether integrated combatives training would help or hurt these Marines. After 4 months of watching them apply these techniques in training and exercises, I can say definitively that they're better warfighters than they were before." "How so, Master Sergeant?" "They're more confident in close-quarter situations, more adaptable when standard tactics don't work, and more capable of handling scenarios that require precision rather than overwhelming force. Those are capabilities that will serve them well in the kind of combat environments they're likely to encounter." The farewell formation held on my last day with Delta Company was both professional and personal. Nearly 300 Marines stood in perfect ranks, their bearing reflecting months of training that had challenged them to grow beyond their comfort zones. Colonel Harrison delivered remarks that acknowledged the successful integration of new training methods and the improved combat readiness that had resulted. But the comments that mattered most came from the Marines themselves. Lance Corporal Hayes, now a qualified combatives instructor, spoke for many of his colleagues when he said, "Ma'am, you taught us that being a better Marine doesn't mean abandoning Marine Corps traditions. It means building on those traditions with new skills that make us more effective warriors." Private Martinez, whose struggles during building clearing exercises had helped justify the combatives training program, had become one of its most dedicated practitioners. "Ma'am, the techniques you taught us aren't just about fighting. They're about having confidence that we can handle whatever situations we encounter, even when those situations aren't what we trained for originally." The impact of integrated combatives training extended beyond Delta Company. Within a year, similar programs were being implemented at Marine Corps installations across the country. The techniques that had once been viewed as unnecessary innovations were becoming standard components of Marine Corps training doctrine. My rotation back to Combat Development Command provided opportunities to refine and expand the training methods that had been tested with Delta Company.
Instead of being seen as a desk officer with theoretical ideas, I was now recognized as someone who had successfully implemented practical innovations that enhanced Marine combat effectiveness. The confrontation with Captain Vale that had started as a professional disagreement had evolved into a catalyst for significant changes in how the Marine Corps approached training and readiness. What began with a broken arm on a California training ground had become a model for integrating new techniques with traditional military values. Years later, when Marines asked about the origins of integrated combatives training, the story they heard wasn't about theoretical research or academic studies. It was about a demonstration that went wrong, a captain who underestimated an opponent, and the moment when 298 Marines learned that effectiveness mattered more than assumptions. The lesson that emerged wasn't just about fighting techniques or training methods. It was about the importance of remaining open to new ideas, even when those ideas challenged assumptions. In an organization built on tradition, the ability to adapt and evolve was what separated units that succeeded from units that merely survived. Captain Vale, who returned to full duty with both physical scars and expanded perspectives, became one of the strongest advocates for integrated training methods. His willingness to acknowledge error and embrace change reflected the kind of leadership that allowed the Marine Corps to remain effective in an evolving strategic environment. The Marines of Delta Company went on to successful deployments where the combatives techniques they'd learned proved valuable in exactly the kinds of close-quarters, complex scenarios where traditional training alone wouldn't have been sufficient. Their experiences validated the training methods and demonstrated that innovation and tradition could coexist successfully. The story of what happened that morning on a dusty training ground became part of Marine Corps lore, told and retold in squad bays and mess halls wherever Marines gathered. But more than a story, it became evidence that the Corps' greatest strength wasn't its adherence to tradition, but its ability to integrate new capabilities while maintaining the warrior spirit that had defined Marines for more than 2 centuries. For me, the experience provided lessons about leadership, innovation, and the complex dynamics of organizational change. Leading Marines required more than technical competence or theoretical knowledge. It required the ability to earn respect through demonstrated performance and to build trust through consistent results. The confrontation with Vale had been painful for both of us, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes change required dramatic demonstration of new possibilities. Sometimes progress demanded the willingness to challenge established authority when that authority resisted improvements that could save lives. The broken arm that had started everything healed, but the changes it had catalyzed became permanent parts of how Marines trained and fought. In military organizations, the most lasting innovations were often those that emerged from practical necessity rather than administrative mandate. Years later, when asked about the incident that had launched integrated combatives training, I always emphasized that success had come not from individual achievement, but from the willingness of Marines to embrace new challenges and expand their capabilities. The techniques were only as valuable as the warriors who mastered them, and the Marines of Delta Company had proven that they could adapt and excel regardless of what was asked of them. The morning when Captain Vale wanted to hit me and ended up with a fractured limb instead became a turning point not just for both of us personally, but for how the entire Marine Corps thought about training, readiness, and the integration of new capabilities with enduring values. Sometimes the most important lessons come from moments when everything goes differently than planned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.